On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I come to you from the beautiful University of Chicago campus in Chicago, Illinois. We're going to take a look at a murder that occurred in 1924, and one which not only shocked the nation then, but is debated to this day. We look at the case of Leopold and Loeb in this edition of Crime Chronicles. On May 22, 1924, in the Hyde Park area near the University of Chicago campus, 14-year-old Bobby Franks was lured into a car driven by 19-year-old Nathan Leopold. Richard Loeb, also age 19, was sitting in the back seat. Loeb was Bobby Franks' cousin. From the back seat, Loeb bludgeoned Franks with a chisel, strangled him, and pulled him to the back seat, where Bobby Franks died. Nathan Leopold had just completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago and was set to enter Harvard Law School. Richard Loeb, a recent graduate of the University of Michigan, was also a student at the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago campus adjoins an area of Chicago known as Hyde Park, a very wealthy and affluent area today as it was in 1924. On May 22nd of that year, a young boy named Bobby Franks was abducted by two older teenagers, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, and brutally murdered. As an illustration as to how heartless these two teenage boys were, after they killed Bobby Franks and stuffed his body in the trunk of their car, they left Chicago for the neighboring state of Indiana, Hammond, Indiana actually, where they were going to dispose of the body. But along the way, they stopped for lunch, hot dog and a drink.
Leopold and Loeb stopped for a quick meal in Hammond, Indiana, with the body of Bobby Franks in their car. Then they took the body to Wolf Lake, about 130 miles southeast of Chicago. They stripped Bobby Franks of his clothes, disfigured his face, genitals, and a scar on his body with acid. Leopold and Loeb wrapped Franks' body in cloth and placed it in a watery area under a culvert by railroad tracks.
After they finished their meal, they took Bobby Franks' body to a place called Wolf Lake in Hammond, Indiana. The reason this place was selected, there were several actually. First off, the plan was to dispose of his body in a watery area in the hopes that it would decay before anyone found it. Also, Nathan Leopold, even at such a young age, was expert in the area of ornithology or bird observations. He knew this area very well and had gone there many times and had even been filmed doing some of his bird watches in the Wolf Lake area.
Even though he was only 19 years old, Nathan, or Babe Leopold, was a renowned ornithologist. It was one of many academic areas where he had talents. He was an astute mathematician, had a gift for learning languages, and was a brilliant scientist. The same could be said about Dickie Loeb.
The awful, senseless crime inflicted upon Bobby Franks had been planned by Leopold and Loeb for several weeks. Leopold and Loeb had engaged in a number of criminal acts prior to this, including some thefts of various sorts. But it turned out that that was not enough to saturate their curiosity, if you will. And we picked this location, the university, because Leopold and Loeb were students at this prestigious university and among the best that this university has ever seen. In fact, Nathan Leopold's IQ was so high that it couldn't be measured with the instruments at that time. It was estimated that his IQ was over 200, and Richard or Dickie Loeb's IQ was around 160. The two boys were wealthy, well off, as was the victim. And in fact, the victim, Bobby Franks, was a distant cousin and a friend to the family of Richard Loeb. Although Bobby Franks was the victim of this crime, actually the original target was another child, an 11-year-old boy named Armand Deutsch. And Leopold and Loeb had planned for weeks to kidnap and murder Deutsch. But the day of the planned kidnapping, it turned out that Armand Deutsch was picked up early from school from his parents and taken to a dental appointment. When that happened, Leopold and Loeb decided simply to kidnap and murder another child. And they settled on Bobby Franks because Loeb was known to Franks and therefore they thought was an easier target. There are many motives when it comes to killing someone, such as robbery, rape, any number of things. What was the motive here? The motive simply was the two young genius boys wanted to try to pull off what they thought was the perfect crime. And that's why the Leopold and Loeb case has been often referred to as the thrill kill case.
Part of their scheme for committing the perfect crime was convincing authorities and the Franks family that their son had been kidnapped and was being held for ransom. They called Bobby Franks' father Jacob that afternoon and told him they had his son and to await a letter that would provide further instructions. Before they made the last-minute decision to abduct Bobby Franks instead of Armand Deutsch, Leopold and Loeb had already written a ransom note demanding $10,000, about $184,000 today. But the two young men did not need the money. The ransom demand was simply part of their twisted motive. They were just having fun. They mailed the letter the day after the murder. An interesting aspect of the letter was that the language used made it apparent that its writer or writers were well educated. It contained words like infraction, execution, and mentioned the futility of calling the police, the type of verbiage not employed by an uneducated person. The letter was addressed Dear Sir, because they were not sure at the time who the victim would be. But Bobby Franks' body was found before the ransom could be acted upon. The case became an immediate media sensation. Police in Chicago and Indiana launched a massive investigation. Many people volunteered to assist in the investigation. One of those volunteers was Dickie Loeb. He was toying with police, who both he and Leopold saw as their intellectual inferiors.
If these two geniuses thought they were about to pull off the perfect crime, they were badly mistaken. The first and most glaring mistake, perhaps, concerned a pair of eyeglasses. Beside the body of Bobby Franks was found a pair of eyeglasses. Now, normally, it would be very difficult to trace a pair of eyeglasses to a person within an area the size of Chicago, let alone Indiana even then. But it turned out that the rims of these eyeglasses were so unusual when they methodically went through all the records of glasses and rims sold in the past few weeks and months. It turns out that only 3 people in the city of Chicago had these kind of glasses. One man who owned such a pair was out of the country at the time that the crime occurred. The other person was a female, and the third person was Nathan Leopold.
The glasses found by Frank's body had a frame spring, which was a recent innovation, and the only dealer in Chicago who sold them was Almer & Co. Police interviewed Nathan Leopold, not really suspecting him. After all, the initial focus was on the teachers at Frank's school. They were interviewing Leopold mainly to rule him out as a suspect, but Leopold's story, including his alibi, was problematic.
When police discovered that the eyeglasses did indeed belong to Nathan Leopold, they questioned him more for the purposes of ruling him out as a suspect than actually charging him. In fact, the initial suspicion fell on the teachers at Bobby Franks' school, some of whom were mercilessly grilled, and in fact, one was injured and won a settlement against the city as a result of the injuries inflicted against him. Leopold, though, claimed he had an alibi, and the alibi was that, first off, he left his glasses there, most likely accidentally, during one of his birdwatching expeditions. He also claimed that he and Dickie Loeb were out cruising for girls at the time this happened in the car owned by his family. Now, there are several problems with that story. First off, it was a lie, and also because when some letters that were written between Loeb and Leopold were found, it turns out that perhaps these two guys were more interested in each other than they might be in girls. On top of that, when the family chauffeur heard about the car being involved, he, trying to clear his master's name, if you will, went to the police and said, oh no, they could have been driving the car because the car was locked up in the garage. And so Nathan Leopold's alibi fell apart very quickly.
When Nathan Leopold was brought to police headquarters, he spilled the beans to his so-called intellectual inferiors and claimed that Richard Loeb killed Franks while he drove. Police were led to Jackson Lake, the place where they dumped the typewriter used for the ransom note to Jacob Franks. Now, the public was riveted on the two suspects and wanted to know more about them, especially as it became clearer that there was nothing typical about Leopold and Loeb compared to many violent criminals or kidnappers.
By all accounts, when Dickie Loeb and Babe Leopold, as they were called by their friends and family, first met, they didn't like each other very much. But they developed a bond, a very strange bond in some ways. Dickie Loeb, by all accounts, first off, was a very handsome young man, also very charming, and the kind of person who had a magnetism. He drew people to him, very well liked, very popular, although very arrogant. Now, Nathan Leopold, by contrast, was physically unattractive, described as very arrogant, sometimes very pushy, and not the kind of person that people tended to gravitate to, although he did have friends. But the real attraction between the two men may have gone much deeper.
The public was stunned and quickly developed a morbid fascination as information about the killers became public. They were both wealthy and extremely intelligent. Born in 1904, Nathan Leopold graduated from the University of Michigan at age 17. His parents were German immigrants, and the family resided on the South Greenwood Avenue in the affluent Kenwood area on Chicago's South Side. His first spoken words came at age 4 months. Leopold claimed that his parents were very distant from him, and that much of his child rearing was done by nannies, one of whom sexually abused him. Nathan Leopold was immersed in the writings of German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his concept of a Superman, a transcendent individual possessing extraordinary and unusual capabilities whose superior intellects allowed them to rise above the laws and rules that bound the unimportant average populace. Leopold believed it was possible that he and Loeb could become such individuals, and as such, by his interpretation of Nietzsche's doctrines, they were not bound by any of society's normal ethics or rules. Richard Loeb, born in 1905, graduated from the University of Chicago at age 18. His father was a lawyer and an executive with the Sears Roebuck Company. He also resided in the Kenwood Avenue Hyde Park area of Chicago's South Side. Richard Loeb committed many petty thefts during his adolescence, not for need of money, but merely for the excitement it offered and the satisfaction he derived from taking advantage of people. But the two boys were opposites in some ways. Leopold was physically unattractive, and many found him alternately awkward and irritating, a bit of a know-it-all. But some thought otherwise. Nathan Leopold was not a loner. He had friends. By contrast, Richard Loeb was matinee idol handsome, popular, and outgoing. Throughout his public ordeal, he received many love letters from female admirers, just as Lyle Eric Menendez did 70 years later when they murdered their parents in California. One thing seemed apparent. Babe Leopold was in awe of the handsome, charismatic Dickie Loeb and would do anything for him.
From the moment that Bobby Franks' mutilated body was discovered, the press of the United States, and for that matter around the world, was titillated by this case. And it brought a number of issues into the discussion. First off, what was the state of American culture at that time? This was the Roaring '20s. And although the term teenager was not in use at the time, a lot of adults thought that America's youth were out of control. This was the era of prohibition, an era of perceived lawlessness, and some people thought the nation was coming apart at the seams, at least in the moral sense. And this crime only further reinforced that phobia.
It was the Roaring '20s, which was a time of economic prosperity for many. But it was also the era of prohibition, when the so-called Great Experiment of banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol generated a disrespect for the law and an enormous increase in organized crime, especially in the Al Capone-dominated city of Chicago. Flush off its victory in World War I, there was concern that American youth were amoral and were experiencing too much prosperity. Some believed the country's moral fiber was coming apart at the seams. It was an era marked with political corruption as well, especially in Chicago, where many politicians and police officers were bought and paid for by organized crime. At the national level, the Teapot Dome scandal was rocking the U.S. government. Upon taking office after the unexpected death of President Warren G. Harding in 1923, the Calvin Coolidge administration discovered that several Harding administration officials, including Interior Secretary Albert Fall, had accepted bribes and kickbacks in exchange for oil leases on government-owned land. It was one of the biggest political scandals in American history. Throughout the Leopold and Loeb ordeal, the media expressed concerns over quote-unquote perversion, which is a 1920s euphemism for homosexuality, although the terms homosexual and gay were not part of the lexicon at the time. Our discussions of same-sex relations were strictly taboo. The undercurrent of perversion came about when it was disclosed that Bobby Franks had been stripped and mutilated, even though there was no evidence that he had been sexually assaulted. There was also an undercurrent of anti-Semitism surrounding the case. Leopold and Loeb were Jewish. The Ku Klux Klan had experienced a strong resurgence in many areas of the U.S. during the 1910s and 1920s, including in the state of Illinois, and Jews and Catholics were as despised by the Klan as were African Americans. Leopold and Loeb perpetuated the stereotype of Jews as sexual degenerates, and the image of Jews in Chicago was not helped by the fact that some of the city's leading crime bosses were also Jewish. Jewish leaders in Chicago's Hyde Park expressed a perverse sense of relief that the victim in the case, Bobby Franks, was also Jewish, as the murder of a non-Jewish child would generate a terror campaign from the Klan.
The families of Leopold and Loeb, although they were grief-stricken by the acts committed by their sons, wanted them to have the best defense counsel possible to save them from the death penalty. Therefore, they hired the most famous criminal defense attorney of the 20th century, a man named Clarence Darrow. The defense of Leopold and Loeb was nicknamed the $1 Million Defense, but actually Darrow charged about $65,000 for their defense, which was a huge sum back in the 1920s.
Clarence Darrow was the most famous criminal defense attorney in the United States at the time, and many legal historians still call him the greatest courtroom orator in American history. He was a rumpled, slovenly, 67-year-old man based in Chicago, and very few could afford to pay him. But Darrow would sometimes take on cases because of the publicity it would generate or because it involved a cause dear to him. Organized labor was one of those causes. Darrow first came to national prominence in Chicago during the 1890s with the case of American Railroad Union leader and avowed socialist Eugene Debs. Even though Darrow's defense of Debs was unsuccessful, and Debs was sentenced to prison for criminal conspiracy and contempt of court, the case made Darrow a national figure and a hero to the political left. In 1905, Darrow defended leaders of the Western Federation of Miners when they were put on trial in Idaho for ordering the murder of former Governor Frank Studenberg. In what was called the trial of the century at the time, Darrow's clients were acquitted. Darrow's reputation suffered a setback with his unsuccessful defense of James and John McNamara, two brothers and labor militants who were convicted of bombing the Los Angeles Times headquarters, causing 21 deaths. Darrow was indicted for jury tampering in the case, but was acquitted at trial. Another high-profile trial would come shortly after the Leopold and Loeb case, when Darrow defended John Scopes, a Tennessee teacher charged with violating a recently passed law that banned the teaching of evolution in public schools. The Scopes monkey trial, as it became known, was mostly theater. John Scopes never taught evolution and volunteered to be arrested and charged as a favor to the local business and political interest in Dayton, Tennessee, who thought publicity from the trial would bring money to the town. Darrow, a devout atheist, was unsuccessful in his defense of Scopes, but won on appeal and further cemented his place in history. With the Leopold and Loeb case, Clarence Darrow involved himself in another passion, his opposition to the death penalty.
The upcoming Leopold and Loeb trial was to be the trial of the century, and anger against the two boys was at a fever pitch, particularly in Cook County, Illinois, where we are now. As the trial date approached, Clarence Darrow knew there was no way he could find an unbiased jury that would save these boys' lives. So he stunned the prosecutor and stunned the public and stunned the sentencing judge when he decided to have his two clients plead guilty.
Leopold and Loeb pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and kidnapping for ransom, both of which were punishable by death in Illinois.
Although there would be no trial for Leopold and Loeb, the sentencing hearing was almost as sensationalistic as any trial would be. Clarence Darrow squarely put the responsibility of sentencing these two boys to death on the judge, John Cavalry. Now, Darrow not only was going to rely on his acumen and prowess in the courtroom as a dramatic courtroom orator, he also knew Illinois precedent in this case, and that favored his clients.
During the hearing, Darrow's oratory was at its best, but he was relying on more than just his theatrical talents. Being based in Chicago, he knew Illinois law well, and he knew that practically no one in Illinois under the age of 21 had been executed after pleading guilty. At that time, any defendant under the age of 20 was considered a minor, and Leopold and Loeb were 19 at the time they killed Bobby Franks. Understanding the enormity of the case and knowing what a formidable opponent Darrow could be, the prosecution, led by State's Attorney and former Judge Robert Crowe, called dozens of expert witnesses, as did Clarence Darrow. The field of psychiatry was in its infancy, and many viewed it as pseudoscience. Psychiatry's reputation took a beating during the Leopold and Loeb hearing, as it appeared that a psychiatrist would merely say what was in the best interest of the party who hired them. One of the experts hired by Darrow was Bernard Glueck, a renowned alienist or forensic psychiatrist from Harvard, and with his wife Eleanor was one of the most famous husband and wife criminological research teams of the 20th century. The prosecution called over 100 witnesses, virtually none of which were questioned by Darrow. He knew it would be a waste of time and effort. During his 12-hour closing argument, Clarence Darrow claimed that Leopold and Loeb were immature and had diseased minds, and therefore they were incapable of fully understanding the gravity of what they were doing or feeling remorse. They had also been desensitized to all the violence around them, especially the violence in World War I, even though neither boy had ever been in the military. He said they killed Bobby Franks as they would swat a gnat or a fly. Therefore, they should be locked away and treated in a psychiatric hospital or prison, but not executed. Throughout most of the trial, the two defendants demonstrated no signs of remorse or worry. If they showed any emotion at all, it was merely a smile or a snicker. They still viewed themselves as superior to those around them. Darrow's tactics paid off. His strategy of having Leopold and Loeb plead guilty, his knowledge of Illinois legal precedent, his brilliant mercy plea, and his knowing that Judge John Calverley was not a fan of the death penalty, accomplished what many thought was impossible. Judge Calverley did not sentence the boys to death.
Clarence Darrow had succeeded in what many people thought was impossible. He had spared the lives of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. What became of the two boys after they were incarcerated? After Clarence Darrow had done the impossible and saved the lives of these two boys, what next? Nathan Leopold said at one point that when he first realized he would have to spend the rest of his life in prison, he didn't know whether he should thank Clarence Darrow or not, because he contemplated committing suicide rather than spend his life in prison. But that was not the case. As for Richard Loeb, he was a model inmate. In fact, like Nathan Leopold, he got heavily involved in education efforts at his facility, teaching classes, organizing schools, things of that nature, and caused no problems. But what led to his death? Accounts differ on why Richard Loeb was killed. The inmate who murdered Richard Loeb in the prison shower is a man named Jack Day. Now, according to some accounts, the two men had a love affair that went wrong, but by other accounts, perhaps the most reliable, Jack Day had been borrowing money or taking money or getting money from Richard Loeb, and Richard Loeb cut him off, and that was the reason that Jack Day murdered Richard Loeb.
The news media stated that prison enhanced Richard Loeb's, quote, unnatural appetites, another euphemism for homosexuality. But Loeb was not known as a sexual predator in prison. On January 28, 1936, he was killed by fellow inmate James Day, who claimed that Loeb tried to sexually assault him. Day killed Loeb with a straight razor, inflicting more than 50 wounds, some of which were defensive, slashing his throat from behind, and surviving unharmed, part of the effort of a person acting in self-defense, as Day claimed. In fact, some evidence suggested that Day propositioned Loeb, not the other way around. Despite the evidence that Day murdered Loeb, he was acquitted at trial, and the public was hardly sympathetic, as Dickie Loeb was still one of the most hated criminals in America. So Richard Loeb was dead. What about Nathan Leopold?
As for their imprisonment lives, the story of Nathan Leopold is probably much more intriguing. Nathan Leopold, still a genius and expert in so many areas, mastered several foreign languages both before and during his imprisonment, taught a number of school subjects to his fellow inmates, again, organized schools, things of that nature, got heavily involved in research. Another thing worth noting is I'm on the University of Chicago campus, a very prestigious university from its inception. But one of its most prized areas, particularly in the early 20th century, was its sociology department and the branch of sociology, criminology. In fact, the foremost researchers, early criminological researchers in the country, were found here at the University of Chicago. And this continued throughout the 20th century. During Nathan Leopold's imprisonment, which wound up lasting over 30 years, he collaborated with the best criminological researchers in the country, men like Edwin Sutherland, Lloyd Olin, Robert Park, Ernest Burgess. And among the things that he helped them research, if you will, were the causes of crime. In fact, he co-authored many prestigious journal articles, academic journal articles, and government reports, but usually used a pseudonym for obvious reasons. Now, the strange thing is this. Nathan Leopold collaborated in creating parole prediction manuals. In other words, he became pretty good at predicting why other people committed crime. But the strange thing is, he could never fully explain why he committed the crime that he did.
While in prison, Nathan Leopold put his genius IQ to work. Already fluent in several languages as a teen, he eventually mastered 15 languages. While in prison at Stateville, he worked with sociologists, psychologists, and criminologists, most of whom had ties to Chicago. All three fields were in their infancy at the time. Leopold wrote or co-authored manuscripts on the causes of crime, parole supervision, and predicting criminal behavior. With Lloyd Olin, a distinguished criminologist, Leopold wrote a comparison of alternative methods of parole prediction for the American Sociological Review, one of the best journals in the fields of sociology. He wrote Parole Predictions of Science with Ernest Burgess, another criminologist, for the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, another prestigious journal. He corresponded and collaborated with Edwin Sutherland, a distinguished criminologist at Chicago and Indiana University, who coined the term white-collar crime and pioneered the study of that behavior. While he could never fully explain why he participated in the remorseless murder of Bobby Franks, the best explanation he could offer was that he did it out of love for Richard Loeb.
After over 30 years of incarceration in the Illinois state prison system, Nathan Leopold was finally paroled in 1958. It was a condition of his parole that he not grant interviews, which he did not want to do anyway, although he gave a press conference upon leaving the state prison in Illinois, just one, and then he asked to be left alone, that he was no longer a public figure and no longer relevant. Well, once his parole expired, Leopold moved to Puerto Rico, and there he married and lived a pretty quiet life, taught school there, and lived the rest of his life in relative peace.
By the late 1950s, Nathan Leopold had served 35 years in prison. In 1958, he published Life Plus 99 Years, his autobiography, in the hopes it might lead to being paroled. Many advocated for his release, including some of the academic criminologists with whom he had partnered. In 1956, a journalist and a University of Chicago graduate named Meyer Levin published a novel titled Compulsion, a quasi-historical account of the murder of Bobby Franks. Leopold refused to collaborate with Levin, offering to work with him on a non-fictional account of the story, an offer that Levin declined. The movie version of Compulsion was released in 1959, with Leopold's character renamed Judge Steiner and played by Dean Stockwell. In the film, Orson Welles, whose character was based on Clarence Darrow, delivered some of the actual content of Darrow's closing argument. Leopold filed suit against Levin, claiming he had been defamed, but the lawsuit was dismissed. Nathan Leopold's Puerto Rican wife Gertrude was a widowed florist. He obtained his master's degree from the University of Puerto Rico. He worked as a medical technician and collaborated with the Church of the Brethren and worked at one of their hospitals in Puerto Rico. Nate, as his neighbors called him, continued his ornithology research and engaged in medical research as well, especially on leprosy. Although he never killed anyone else, Leopold was far from reformed, even in middle age. He was charged with several crimes, including statutory rape and charity fraud, but never convicted. Although he was married, he continued to engage in gay relationships, some of which he had started in prison. Leopold frequented gay bars in Puerto Rico and hired young male prostitutes. In 1971, Nathan Leopold died from a heart attack brought on by diabetes. He was 66 years old. The Leopold and Loeb case is part of popular culture and has been mentioned or served as a foundation for countless writings, plays, TV programs, and films from different angles and perspectives. It was even mentioned in the 1990 sitcom Seinfeld, as the phrase Leopold and Loeb has been used to describe a pair of people who would commit a dastardly act in tandem but not alone. In addition to Compulsion, Rope, based on a 1929 play inspired by the Franks murder, was released in 1948 and directed by British film legend Alfred Hitchcock. The victim and or the victim's family are often overlooked in sensational crimes like the Franks murder. Bobby Franks sometimes played tennis with his cousin Richard Loeb. He was a gifted student at the Harvard School in Chicago and was a champion debater. Not wanting their son to be remembered only for his death, in 1930, the family of Bobby Franks helped establish the Robert E. Franks Memorial Building in Chicago, a center for helping young boys. It was later renamed the Chicago Youth Center's Sidney Epstein Center and is located at 3415 West 13th Place in Chicago.
Despite all that has been written about the Leopold and Loeb case, all the plays, all the movies, all the books based on this case, the question still exists. Why? Why was this done? It certainly was not done for money. It certainly was not done for any sexual thrill, although that was kind of an undercurrent of this case. And it was believed that the two boys suffered, if you will, or were psychopaths, sociopaths, and now the term is antisocial personality. That still does not explain why they did what they did. There are millions of people who walk around with antisocial personalities who don't have regard for the feelings of others, but still don't go around murdering little boys. So the question will never be definitively answered as to why this crime occurred. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.